Welcome to Simple Conversations with ASG.
So tell me, who is Robert B. O'Connor?
Robert B. O'Connor is a Yank, a husband, a father of 3 grown sons, and a grandfather of a 2-year-old named Sam O'Connor. And a writer all his life, mostly commercial writing, and then recently books, a nonfiction book, and now Jeep Show, A Trooper at the Battle of the Bulge, which is a novel.
Incredible. Something's just played in my mind there, but what is the difference between like a normal writer and a commercial writer?
Well, when I say commercial writer, I'm talking about advertising, copywriting. I'm writing brochures and advertisements for clients. So that was my background in writing that, and just general business writing. I started out my career at the big soap company in Cincinnati, Procter & Gamble, and I was actually sent to remedial memo writing school to learn the Procter & Gamble style of writing. So I have been essentially writing all my career. It's just in the last few years I've turned to writing books.
Great. So I found out a weird fact about you. There's a few people from the UK and Ireland that listen to my show, and they're going to be quite fascinated by how this came about. How does a Yank support Wigan Athletic?
Well, 2 things. One is I did a year at a state school in England in 1974 and 75. Actually took a couple of A-levels. Don't want to talk about the results, but took a couple of A-levels just for the experience. And so I became familiar, this was before the Prem, I became familiar with the English football leagues. And then about 20 years ago now, there came a soccer channel on American television. And for some reason, of the first 10 games I watched, Wigan Athletic was playing in 6 of them. It's a very small club, as you know. They were in the Premier League for 6 years, which is astonishing. And so I just saw them, and like many people, I like an underdog. And it's very dramatic. The team has been very dramatic. They actually won the FA Cup in 2000, which was astonishing. And then they almost went out of business twice in the years after that. And literally both times we supporters passed the hat so they could make payroll while they figured things out. So I came about it sort of randomly. And then, the more you know about a team, the more interesting it is. So, and then, of course, when I talk to my, American friends, they just know nothing about it, which is funny.
There's like a real cult of people like you that came from America to like England and places they got to like study and ended up going home with the most outlandish supporting cast. Like, there's been a few that have been on the show that supported Barnsley and Bradford, and I haven't seen the name Barnsley or Bradford in the football pyramid in a long time. I just never understand how you it just shows how much you do root for an underdog. People in England and Ireland would never support those teams.
Right. Yes, one of my friends is a Manchester United supporter, and I constantly accuse him of getting in front of a parade. And fortunately, it's been very difficult for him the last few years. They deserve it.
Yeah, we'll say a prayer for him.
Yeah.
But what's annoying you this week, Robert?
My wife and I made a somewhat off-the-cuff decision to move from Memphis, Tennessee, where we don't really have winter, to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where it's polar.
It's all winter.
It's polar up there. And the reason is we have a 2-year-old grandson that we want to spend time with, and his parents, of course. And it was a little bit of a spontaneous decision. And what's annoying me now is how much crap I've accumulated in the last 30 years that I have to sort through to decide what is worth paying to move to Minneapolis from Memphis. And it's harder than I thought it would be. I have many, many books. A lot of them I got for research for the books I was writing. And boy, it's just hard to part with them, even though I'm sure I don't need them. So that's what's annoying me this week.
Yeah, I moved out of my family home about a year ago to a really small apartment, and trying to little down what I needed to take and what I needed to keep at home was so hard. Like, even a year on now at Christmas, I went back and took loads of stuff back up here with me. I've left so much stuff at home that I realised now I need. It has to be the most difficult decision, is moving and understanding what am I never going to need again. And then randomly the next day you'll need it.
Of course.
It's the worst thing ever.
Well, you have to expect
so many books.
You have to expect that things will come up. I've told my wife, this move is going to be difficult. We just don't know exactly how. So.
Yeah. No matter how much you plan it, you've always forgot something.
Yes,
always.
Absolutely.
I'm still there's still things I need to get, and I've never went and got them because it just seems like a task I don't want to do.
Yeah. And it's 13 hours. The drive from Minneapolis back to Memphis is 13 hours. So I don't want to be, coming back every couple of days to get a book or, a favorite pen or something like that. We'll probably, the things that I inevitably forget, I'll just have to buy again in Minneapolis.
Right, we'll get away from moving because all the young breeds that are listening to the show have had enough of it. We'll talk about first we'll give a little bit of an intro to these two books that you wrote in specific that we'll talk about, and then we'll get into the topics kind of. But can you go through the first book? I know the Jeep Show is the latest one, but can you go through the book before that kind of set up the Jeep Show?
Yeah. The backstory, the book is called Gumption Aid, a booster for your self-improvement plan. The backstory is several years ago, I went through just events had piled up, unfavorable events had piled up in my life, and I went through a month of quite severe depression. Amazingly, on day 31, I woke up and I was like, I'm better. I don't know what happened, but I'm better. And I haven't had it was 30 days of hell, and I haven't had any episodes since. I'm happy to report I had to go to work while I was in this 30 days. I owned an ad agency at the time, so I had to show up, but I couldn't. I was too distracted and depressed and anxious to do any work. So I just started sitting at my desk and just writing, journaling almost. How did I get in this awful situation, and how can I get out of it? And it was mostly garbage what I was writing, or as you say in Ireland, rubbish. What I was writing, but the process, I liked the process. And after I got better, I just kept writing. After a few years, I had long, boring chapters about it. I hired a professional editor, and over the time turned it into a book really about morale and how to do better, how to avoid stupid mistakes in your life like the ones I had made, and how to do better. And it did extremely well sales-wise. Apparently, there's an endless appetite in America for self-help books. If you want to be a commercial success, I'd start there. So I wrote that book, and one of the key passages of the book is I tell my readers about a quote that I found on my father's desk. And as I say in the book, I think that quote was both an inspiration and a scourge. And it has been the same for me. And the quote is from a 19th century British biologist named Thomas Huxley, who interestingly was Aldous Huxley's father. And Huxley wrote, "The most valuable result of all education is to do the thing you have to do when it needs to be done, whether you like it or not." And boy, that struck me, because I felt I had not done some of the things that needed to be done when they needed to be done because I didn't want to. They were uncomfortable or hard. I really worked with that, and I wish I had had a chance. I never asked my dad about it. If I could go back and ask him one question, I would say, Pops, tell me why that quote was on your desk and what it meant to you. But I've had to kind of piece that together myself. So after I wrote that book, I realized that at this stage of my life, writing books would be my work. And when I say work, and I think this is an important concept, your work isn't always how you make your living. I mean, God willing, you make your living in something that is not incredibly boring and, painful and torturous. But your work, if your work is painting or gardening, or in my case, writing books, that's what you get up. That's what gets you up every morning to do. You may still have to go to work and be a lawyer or be a kindergarten teacher, but I realized that my work was writing. So I set off to write another book, and that book turned out to be Jeep Show. I was going to write about a nonfiction about a legend at Procter & Gamble that I was told about when I was there. I'll just briefly say there was something called the Oxydol Circus in 1968, where a circus promoter had convinced the Oxydol brand manager to sponsor his traveling circus. It turned out to be a disaster, humorous only in retrospect. And I was going to write about this because I knew I had an audience in Cincinnati that would be interested. And I managed to reach the circus promoter's daughter. The circus promoter was long passed away. And she said, "Oh yeah, my dad did circus promotion after the war, but did you know that in World War II he was an enlisted entertainer?" And I said, "No, what's an enlisted entertainer? You know, I know about USO, and I didn't know then, but I know now about ENSA, the British version of USO." And she said, "Oh yeah, they were military occupation specialty 442, entertainment specialists." And not only that, but my father did Jeep shows with the famous, at the time, Hollywood star Mickey Rooney, speaking of Irish names. And I said, "Oh my good Lord." And I said, and then she said, "By the way, his older sister, my Aunt Mabel, saved every letter he wrote home from basic training and training camps and then the European Theater of Operations." And I said, "My goodness, may I come down to Dallas and look at those letters? You know, I'll be very careful with them and wear cotton gloves." And she said, "Oh, don't worry. My sister published them in a book." So I got this. I just ordered this book from Amazon and had all this primary source material. And then in the endless internet, I found the Army's manual for the Morale Corps in 1944, which is, to read it now is almost unreal. You know, it was such a different time, but it was, you know, things like, you know, you order microphone M17 to hook up to the Jeep's battery. You know, you order trailer M if you're going to have scenery in your show. And so she told me they did Jeep shows for combat soldiers at the front line where the USO or the Red Cross could not go. So I learned all about that. I read all his letters that he wrote home, and it was absolutely fascinating. I decided, though, to make it fiction for two reasons. One, I hadn't written fiction before, so I thought it would be an interesting challenge, which it was. And then secondly, I wanted to involve him in the Battle of the Bulge, which I'm sure you've heard of, but may not know. The Battle of the Bulge was a kind of desperate last gamble by Hitler and Germany in the war, and it was the largest and remains the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. So I wanted to involve this character in that, and I wanted the challenge of writing fiction. So we got Jeep Show.
Amazing. It's good to see that those two different dynamics, one about, you know, a hard time coming through it and self-improvement, and then also soldiers coming back from quite a mentally tough time and having to reset before going back to normal life, both across the topic of morale, which I think today is kind of like an untouched subject, because people from my generation around my age would only have seen the word morale in a video game. So they wouldn't really know what it means, you know. In like normal life, you would never really use it in a conversation. So
yeah.
Can you give it an explanation in your own words of what morale is and how you tried to highlight it as much as possible?
Yeah. I will start with a famous quote, at least famous in the military, from Napoleon. And Napoleon wrote, "Morale is to the material as 3 is to 1." There's also a more folksy quote that's probably out of style in America now, but they talk about it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. And we all know, you know, if we're older than about 15 years old, we all know the value of, you know, how the right mental attitude will help us overcome difficulties. You know, and so morale is that ability to overcome difficulties, or as Huxley said, to do the hard things when they need to be done, whether you like it or not. So it's an essence. You can't put your arms around it. It's a mental state, and it becomes a habit. And one of the things I talk about is if it becomes a habit, it affects character. And character, willpower and enthusiasm are great when you're starting something, but willpower and enthusiasm usually fail, eventually. Whereas character and our kind of self-morale that comes from character are much more reliable and dependable. So that's my windy definition of morale. And then in Jeep Show, one of my main points is when people are going through a hard time, and this certainly applies to combat infantry and, the discomfort and danger of being frontline combat infantry. When people are going through a hard time, and it could be, somebody just lost a family member, it's the way we best boost their morale is simply by being present. So these Jeep Show entertainers, including the world famous Mickey Rooney, would get in their Jeep and they would drive to just behind the front lines. And these frontline combat soldiers, in their American Army, they got plenty of ammunition and gasoline, but they didn't get much else. They didn't get the good clothing because it kind of got taken by the rear echelon. They didn't get the comforts that soldiers in the rear echelon got, and they certainly didn't get the entertainment that soldiers in the rear echelon got. So the fact that here comes Mickey Rooney and two other entertainment soldiers, and they drive up and they jump out of their Jeep and hook up their microphone and do a kind of corny vaudeville show. It's not so much the show, and I quote an ENSA entertainer in the book. It's not so much the show as it is the being present, the being physically present. And as the ENSA guy says, as the ENSA entertainer says, he says, "Now you saw me tonight." I won't try to do my British accent, by the way, because it's horrible. Now you saw me tonight. I'm not but a poor man's George Formby. But imagine you're a 19-year-old Tommy from Lancashire, never been farther than Blackpool for a donkey ride. Him and his mates are guarding an oil field in Libya, 1,000 miles from home. Mail and rations delivered once a week, 120 degrees at noon, sand fleas, bath once a month. Can't even get Lord Haw Haw on the wireless. Well, you're chuffed to see anyone from England, aren't you? Scotland will do, even Ireland, he says in a passable Irish brogue. Now, my act is half pie. I'm no name and never will be. I don't have the gifts. But the thing is, mate, morale is the showing up, the being there. The performance, sure, but also the natter over tea and a biscuit, letting the lads know they're not forgotten, like letters from home. That I can do. What I took away from that is that's how we really help our friends and family. It's not so much that we have the answers, the solution, it is that we can show up and be present. That's my take on, that's my take on morale.
I think that's something that's been lost a lot, is like the impact just being there for someone is going to have. Because I heard this a while ago and it put it in perspective for me, but there's like this guy that I think he was going through quite a hard time with. I'm not sure if he lost someone in his family or it was just multiple people in his family were getting sick, or they were going through tough patches, and it was obviously playing on him because he had a lot to do. But one of his friends pretty much never really spoke, maybe reached out once, but they said to him, "Why do you not reach out to him? He's obviously not in a great space." And they said, "Well, to be honest, I don't know how I'm going to be able to help him in any way. Like I can only ask him about his day so many times before he starts talking about something that's going to upset me." And when the guy eventually came out of this tough period, he started becoming really good friends with one of the older guys that the rest of them didn't really like too much. And when he was asked one night about it, "Why are you so friendly with him but not with us anymore?" And he said, "Because his impact simply being there stopped me from being in a grave."
Yeah.
Quite literally the simplest thing on earth.
Yeah. Don't ever ask somebody that's, somebody that's lost somebody important or, something. Don't ever ask them how they feel because
No,
they don't
never.
want to say, just say, just go and sit with them and, bring a deck of cards or just in case. But yeah, it's just the being present. And that's what I took away from these enlisted entertainers and their effect on frontline combat soldiers or 18-year-old British soldiers stuck in Libya, 1,000 miles from anything. It is simply the being present.
If you are enjoying this episode, follow and rate the show.
Yeah, you'd be surprised amongst a little bit of company. It doesn't even have to be anything too serious. There was a few years ago back where I'm from. I heard this. I heard people talking about how there was this guy who was he was in hospital over a crash, but he never had nothing too badly serious wrong with him. But like they were always finding things in his bloods that weren't right, and you couldn't really discharge him or anything. And because he couldn't feel that he had lost any kind of ability or anything, but being in the hospital all the time, like kind of played on him that there's something that they're not telling me. He was really down, and he literally never really broke like stride, never had any kind of upsetness or unhappiness. And whenever he came out of hospital, his dad was like, "What happened?" And he was saying like every single day, my friends would come and sit in the waiting room, just have a normal conversation between them. Most of the times, I wasn't even involved, but the fact that they were there and indirectly including me made me feel like I wasn't just stuck in a hospital bed. I was just sitting anywhere with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So simple.
And I think for humans to, when something terrible happens or you're stuck on the front lines, miles and miles from civilization, it's easy to feel isolated. And, once you feel isolated, other bad feelings, you feel disconnected and isolated. And yeah, it's very, very hard on you. One thing I pointed out in the book that relates to morale, and I'll just read you another paragraph, but
this little book of quotes is amazing.
I wrote there's a war correspondent character in the book, and he was very useful because when you're writing fiction, when you're writing nonfiction, you can just tell the readers what you want them to know. When you're writing fiction, you're not allowed to tell the readers. You're supposed to show them.
You have to lead them down the path.
Yeah, through dialogue and what happens and all that. So I put a war correspondent in the book so that he could tell the main character all about, the defense of Bastogne and the larger strategies that the main character knew nothing about. I had this war correspondent. I read several books about Europe right after the war and, what a disaster it was. These mass migrations of people right after the war heading from east to west, especially. And then, all the slave laborers that the Nazis had enslaved, heading back to their home countries. It was just complete chaos. So I had this war correspondent write a column for his newspaper about post-war Europe. And I loved it, worked very hard on it, turned out very well. And my editor said, you can't put this in the book because you have to end the book with something that happens to the main character. And I was like, damn it. Of course, one of the problems with writing is you fall in love with things you've written and then you have to kill them. So since it's the age of the internet, I stuck this letter on my website instead, so that probably just so I could go read it once in a while and marvel
just so it's out there.
Yes, marvel at my writing. But the part that gets to morale, I just want to read you one of the paragraphs from this fictional letter, from this fictional newspaper column, and it is this. America fielded millions of citizen soldiers who disliked the goddamn army, were ambivalent about their officers, and resisted the trappings of military hierarchy, also known as chicken shit. Yet many of them will remember their service as the ennobling experience of their lives. If you ask them, they will tell you they fought not for their country or for lofty ideals, but for each other, for their buddies, to get the job done and get home. Reflecting on our conversation and that it is, the idea of being present is, when you're physically present for a friend or a family member who is going through a brutal time, you're preventing them from feeling completely isolated. You are you're there for them. And these frontline combat soldiers became very attached to each other and would literally lay down their lives for each other. And, I think the Bible has something like, there's no greater love than a man lay down his life for his brother. These frontline combat soldiers, found morale in each other and looking after each other. So that also kind of developed my thinking about morale.
I like this kind of topic of like just being there for people, because I think it is kind of an undervalued thing in today's society. But there's something that does play in my mind whenever I hear that is, in the last year or so, I've spoke to some people that they've achieved some incredible things. And I mean, there's other people then have also overcame some of the biggest adversities out there. And every single time I ask them, was there one thing that helped you, or one thing that you look back now and stood out? And it's like that. I literally wouldn't have been able to do this without that. They always say their environment, and I understand that it's nailed out every day on TV and on the internet. Their environment is so key, but I still don't think we take it in. And a main thing that we need to understand about environment is, before we go on to the good parts of it, is, and this will relate to the being there part. When should people just exit an environment that they can see is bad, but they're maybe thinking in the back of their mind, maybe is it just me at the moment, or is there an actual bad situation I'm in and I need to get out of it?
I can, I'm a writer, not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so I just have to
Neither am I.
think back. I just have to think back on my own experience, and that I went through several periods where I wasn't alcoholic, but I could see it from where I was standing. I wasn't addicted. I wasn't addicted to gambling, but I could see it from where I was, and I got out of those situations by reflecting. Some of my family members were alcoholic, and I saw what it did to their lives. I am aware of people that are addicted to gambling or other negative behaviors. So I guess part of it is I was able to reflect on other people's misery from these situations, from these environments. I sought, when I was going through this very bad time, I sought counseling. And so I would never underestimate the positive impact from talking about your when you're in the situation, it's very confusing. Looking back a few years later, it's very clear, but when you're in it, and I would always suggest that people would find a professional, a counselor, to talk to about their situation and how they feel about it. There should, if you're lucky, you've got a wise friend, a wise relative as well who can comment on it, but it's invaluable to involve a professional counselor in that to give you that perspective, because when we're in these situations, we really don't have the perspective on it.
A lot of your book does mention that the troops and soldiers, they almost push through the hard things because they want to do it for the people next to them, and that is like such a good sign of teamwork and leadership and stuff like that. And do you think that's maybe a sign for people to look at in their own environments, to think, if there was something really hard that came up, would I do it for these people? Would I be willing to do the uncomfortable and work hard through things I don't want to do for these people to make them happy?
Yeah, I can. It's an interesting question. What I'd reflect on is, if you're down in the dumps, and you want to raise your mood, do something for somebody else. Whether it's a friend or it's your 2-year-old nephew or your own, get your focus away from yourself and do something for somebody else. You don't want to turn yourself into a doormat or, somebody's lackey. Yes, I think reaching out and serving others is a key to the morale and a happy life.
Do you think we're kind of losing that? Maybe our main focus on what these things are going to do for us rather than how we're helping other people?
I don't. Human nature, technology changes and politics changes, but human nature doesn't change. And I think that, as we mature, we are able to see not just from our own perspective, what we want immediately, but, what is best for everybody. I will say this, most people never grow up.
Never.
There are, many people do, but what I see in behavior of people who are, of age is most people never grow up, and they often don't lose those childish or teenage prejudices, fears, concerns, that kind of thing. So I do think that we need to be aware, and it's very helpful for us to be aware of other people and their needs, and within healthy boundaries, serving other people. I don't think it's any different now. I mean, people were assholes, 50 years ago and 100 years ago and 500 years ago. We're less violent now in general. There are examples of terrible violence, but in general, social relations were less violent than we were, 100 years ago. But I think people are essentially the same.
How important do you think the hiring of people like Mickey Rooney was for those troops and soldiers before they went back to normal civilization?
Well, one thing that made Mickey Rooney important is all the soldiers understood that he didn't have to be there, that he was choosing to do this risky job. He was a huge star. Imagine, Brad Pitt or somebody like that today. Jerry Seinfeld, fine men, both of them. But Rooney was under he did enlist in 1944. He was under some public pressure because of his age to enlist, but he could have done his military service honorably in Hal Roach Studios in Los Angeles, which would have been 10 minutes from his house in Beverly Hills. Lieutenant Ronald Reagan did honorable service there, making films for the Army Signal Corps. Rooney chose to go to Europe, to go overseas, and then to be in these Jeep shows. So it was very significant to the soldiers. It kind of represented to them an example of the sacrifice they were making as well. So I think that was very, very important. And it was important to the American war morale as a nation to see these Hollywood stars, and especially Rooney, doing this duty. There was a very famous actor at the time, you may not know of him, a man named Jimmy Stewart. Very famous actor, very successful actor at the time. He became a B-24 pilot, which was about the most dangerous job in the United States military, doing bombing missions over Italy and Germany. And he literally did 25 bombing missions. Very inspirational, put himself in harm's way. And I think the same thing applies to Mickey Rooney.
Yeah, I asked Scott Fryer about this because he was in British Army and he served 2 terms in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he mentioned about a week before they went home, they were all kind of like bundled into this like castle type thing, and they had comedians, they had actors, they had like circus acts and stuff. And he said that most of the time they weren't really like paying attention to them. A lot of the time they were just drinking and taking their frustrations out in each other, like fighting with each other and trying to run away and stuff. But he said whenever he like looks back and he talks to people who didn't have that experience when they came back from their term served, it helps you not go into normal world and like, oh my god, I'm so far behind everybody. I've literally been fighting wars for how long, and now I'm back and I've no qualifications, no job, I don't know what I'm doing. The world has moved on without me. Where's that shop I used to walk by every day? Like he says that it was such a simple thing. Like most of the comedians that were there knew that they were not getting, nobody was listening to their jokes. Like he actually said that there was 3 comedians there and he honestly doesn't remember any of them. But having them just there and stand there and being willing to write jokes for an hour, just to entertain them, was like, you know what, maybe I can go back and at least give it the time of day and not just suffocate into my own wee bubble and be like, oh my god, I don't know what's going on now.
Yeah, it gets back to this this isolation that combat soldiers came back from World War II in Britain and in the US, and they in general did not talk about their war experience because they felt that the civilians would not understand. Now, America was never bombed during the war. The civilians in London understood a great deal more about what it was like to be in combat. So perhaps it was not as alienating for the British troops returning, or at least the ones returning to London. But yeah, the transition that the soldiers in World War II and in any war have to go through to get back to civilian life and be comfortable is fascinating. In fact, my sequel to Jeep Show is going to be about this soldier returning to the United States and trying to reestablish his entertainment career. There was a very, very significant piece of legislation passed in America. They did not have a similar one in Britain. It was called the GI Bill. And basically, the American government paid for all veterans of World War II to help them buy a house if they wanted, or to send them to college. And this was an incredibly successful way of getting these veterans back into American life and then preparing them for a life they would probably not have had without the GI Bill. I'll give you an example. My father came back from World War II. He was from an Irish Catholic working class family in Waterbury, Connecticut. He ended up going to Yale University on the GI Bill. He was a little bit of a fish out of water, but he graduated. He made it through. That changed his life and my life. He then was had a white collar job. He was an accountant and a financial person, and he insisted that his children be educated as well as we could be. So that transition back to civilian life, in some ways, is harder after World War II, where everybody was in it all the way. Whereas take the Vietnam War in America, very unpopular, very politically divisive, and the soldiers returning home were not greeted with special programs, or certainly were not greeted as returning heroes, and they had tremendous problems readjusting to civilian life. Some of them still do.
There's a part at the start you said that it stuck a question in my head that I think we can relate to, like, now in modern times, which I'm trying to do as much as possible, because I feel like the lines do cross quite a lot, but they're maybe said in different terms. But you mentioned that the soldiers coming home maybe thought that people couldn't understand what they've just done or what they've been through. And I feel like in today's world, that's a problem a lot of people have. They don't feel like anybody relates to what they're going through. And obviously you've had a term of being quite down for a while, and I've also had experiences with it, so we can kind of understand what I mean by that standpoint. But do you think that those counselling sessions you mentioned before helped you understand that maybe I'm not the only one going through this? Maybe there's people that actually would want to take care of me in this situation because they know what I've been through.
Well, certainly when I was in that, when I was going through this really, really rough patch, I reached out to my good friends, and, I reached out to family. I wasn't that isolated. I'll also tell you one thing, and you may have had the same experience. If you're lucky, you go through a very difficult patch, and, if you're lucky, you come out in one piece. And what it did for me, and, tell me if it did the same thing for you, is it gave me tremendous empathy for other people, because I thought, for 30 days, I was super depressed and anxious and just in horrible shape. Well, there's people that are like that every day, and I'm just full of admiration for those people for getting through the day, because, I did it for only 30 days and it was absolutely horrible. So it is, so I guess if you're lucky, suffering and surviving suffering gives you empathy for other people. And that certainly changed me. I was not, as many, many young men are, I was not very empathetic to other people. I was not a bastard all the time, or even most of the time, but I really didn't consider other people's feelings or sufferings, and going through it myself and having some guidance going through it brought me out of it with much more empathy for what people go through. So now, when somebody, when I see somebody behaving in an obnoxious fashion, first, my first goal is to get some distance from them, of course, especially if they're drunk. But I'm not immediately judgmental. It's
No.
like, well, that guy may be having the worst day of his life. Who knows? So that was also the result of that. And these wartime close relationships of these combat soldiers, what I've found is they were very intense, but they were not long lasting, in that these soldiers got home to America, and as fast as they could, whether, through the GI Bill or, they got into America, into civilian life as fast as they could. And they weren't looking each other up constantly and, that kind of thing. The relationships were intense and meaningful, but not long lasting in my research.
Yeah, I done a Q&A for 1 year of the show recently, and one of the questions was what was like a lesson I've learned from like going through like depression and beating it and stuff.
Yeah.
And that was something that I didn't answer the question because I couldn't really think of one thing in particular, but I realized since that it kind of just killed my judgment of people and provoked my curiosity, which is probably why I'm doing this now. Because even when like I get anybody on, like even whenever I got you on, I was bringing you on, and I didn't know what we were going to talk about. I had no like judgment of, I think he's maybe smarter than me, or he's out of like I'm out of my depth here. I just wanted to ask questions. I mean, one of your assistants got a line of questions longer than what we've asked today. I mean, I think that was something that I picked up on. Is I don't know if it's you don't judge people, but you've gone through so much yourself. You kind of look at people and you look at their actions, especially, and you're like, maybe there's a reason they're being angry. Maybe there's a reason they're answering me sharp. Maybe they're going through something. So, do you think that maybe that helped those soldiers come back to civilian life a little bit easier? They were walking around without judgment, not only on thinking about other people, but what those people were thinking of them.
That's an interesting question. I think, from what my research showed is, having survived what they survived, and even for the rear echelon soldiers, they got 2 or 3 years taken out of their young lives, being overseas, and so they did come back, as you say, kind of behind on things in some ways. I think they came back, perhaps, certainly with a greater appreciation for civilian life, and being able to get through the day without grave threat of wounds or death. And then another thing they came back to is the Army, even the American Army, which was very much citizen soldiers, very hierarchical, and most of the soldiers, were not crazy about their officers. There were some officers that they really respected, and they were neutral about others, but there were many officers that, they felt were, as I said, just full of chicken shit. And so they were coming back, not being under orders, gave them an appreciation, having been under orders. And, when you're under orders, they say, pick up this bazooka and go try to shoot that German tank, which is extremely dangerous. Well, you have to do it, whereas in civilian life, you're not under orders. And I think that was a big help to returning veterans, was to get away from the hierarchy of the Army.
Do you have any last messages to the audience before you go, Robert?
Yeah, the advice that I would have related to morale and related to being present for each other, and it's really just occurred to me in the last several years, and of course I've told it to my sons, is do as much as you possibly can, do what you say you will do. It's very easy to say, your friend's birthday's coming up and he says, we're all going to meet in the pub at such and such a time. It's very easy to say, oh, sure, I'll see you there. And then, You don't show up because whatever, you were supposed to go to the films with your cousin, you don't, or you just don't feel like it. And your friend, you're missed by your friend. So I think it's very, very important, morale wise, for you and for your friend. You do what you say you will do, knowing that at least half the time when it comes time to do what you say you will do, you won't feel like it. But once you do it, you'll be glad you did. And a big part of that is also, and I've had to learn this, being careful about what you say you will do. So if your friend says, I'm moving, from home to a flat, next Tuesday at midnight, well, before you say, sure, I'll be happy to help you, I'll be there. You have to say, hey, Angus, I need to think about that and talk to my missus to make sure that, we can do that. So that's part. So that's my last words is we should all really be careful to do what we say we'll do, because trust is the glue that holds civilization together. And part of that is just being really thoughtful. And thank you so much for the conversation. It's been great.
Follow your new favorite interviewer with the link in the description.